All right, we are recording, so we will jump into Chapter 9 material. Dealing with nationalism and sectionalism. Also referred to as the error of good feelings. As our country is slowly becoming a expanding commercial nation, characterized by enterprise, experimentation, and geographical expansion, there's still a tension. There is a tension between nationalistic sentiments and sectional sentiments. The issue for administrations beginning with James Madison and then going to James Monroe and then eventually Andrew Jackson are how do you balance the economic interests and the social needs of the three sections, which would be the Northeast, the South, and then the West, which was continuing to develop and expand. How do you balance those regional, sectional interests with the national interests? Those three sections all had different economic interests. They all had different political goals. So how is that going to play out as the federal government continues to develop and grow, and there is a national consciousness now, a national economy, along with a national government? So let's begin with nationalism. And this chart basically lays side by side the interests of nationalism versus sectionalism. Nationalists, which would be those that were, we might also call them federalists, and they would vote for the Federalist Party, believe that national interests are placed ahead of regional ones. In popular culture, literature, you're having a unique American style start to develop. So a national culture is emerging. And then, just as it is today, you have a unique American English dialect. And even in 1806, you can see here, Noah Webster, when he put together his first dictionary, there were 5,000 words that were unique to America that you would not have found in other European countries or writings. Would you put that sign up for me? Okay, thank you. See you later. So you're also having with a national government or political philosophy evolving, a national economic outlook, a national culture that is starting to sprout up. And New England in the Northeast would be a big driver of the national interests. Remember, this section, this region of the country is known for their industrial economic situation with factories and mills, logging industry, fishing industry. That is juxtaposed to the southern section that is ignited by slavery, which is the slave labor is the backbone to the cotton industry. So the South remains a mainly agrarian region, farming, agriculture, whereas the North is becoming more industrial and urban. Also, you're starting to see a moral divide as Northerners, as all the northern states have outlawed slavery and starting to really promote that it's an immoral practice that is more prominent, more important than just a economic one. Southerners, of course, saw slavery as absolutely essential. And so their concern was that with the new Louisiana Territory, as more states are admitted into the Union, that there needs to be a balance of free states and slave states. So let's look at nationalism first. Let me share with you some elements of a model of nationalism. This is not on the slide, so there's 5 elements here that I want to share with you. These are not in the book, so you might want to know them. The elements that we're really producing here a model of nationalism, of American nationalism, because with the Napoleonic Wars and other wars in Europe, you're seeing more and more nationalism spring up around the world. But for American nationalism, the first key element is that they are starting to have a common past, a common heritage. The American Revolution, Revolutionary War, that all Americans shared in their fight against England. The drafting of the Articles of Confederation, and then scrapping that for the Constitution. These are common, this is a common heritage that all Americans have. The second element in this model of nationalism is a sense of a common destiny. Going back to the Puritans of Massachusetts, who believed that they were a new Israel, and that their brethren to the east, the Pilgrims, they believed that they were set up to be a city on a hill, to be a shining example back to England. And then as liberty spread in the 13 colonies, there's this sense of a national destiny. Democratic institutions of government are starting to spring up, in town halls and state governments. And now with a national government and a rising strain of republicanism that is really coming to the surface during this time, Americans have this sense of destiny. Now, as they continue to move west, it's going to be known as manifest destiny. And so this is one of the elements that is a part of this model of American nationalism. A third element was that all Americans, is that Ethan in class at Spiro?
Ethan's here now.
Okay, thanks. A third element was all Americans had a common enemy, and that was England at the forefront, but then also the rest of Europe. Not that they are not that England and Europe are mortal enemies who want to just absolutely annihilate Americans, but as Americans have this shared destiny and their shared sense of heritage, and they're expanding westward. They had the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812 with England, which we didn't really cover. I hope you were able to read about that. But and then we've had skirmishes with France. Spain still has territory. They still have Florida and other territory. So there's a sense in that these are enemies who are against this independence that Americans now have, and they're enemies against that independence continuing to grow and expand. We will see next Tuesday that this is addressed with a very well-known doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine under President Monroe's administration. So a common enemy. And even today, wouldn't you say that there is this sense of it's America versus the world in some sense? More politically speaking, because citizens of other nations still want to come to America because they want to have freedom. But politically speaking, there's still kind of a sense of America versus everyone else. And even in United Nations meetings, in the G8 summits and things like that, there is a lot of focus on the President of the United States being there, and sometimes what is highlighted is how he's so different, or the United States' position is so different than other countries. A fourth element of this model of nationalism that we see emerging in this early part of the 19th century are the myths that are starting to be circulated in America. For example, the framers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, our founding fathers, a myth starts to crop up that these men were really like demigods. They were not mere ordinary men. They were special in some way, almost part divine. And no one else could have come up with this fantastic form of government. And so that is one of the myths that is being promulgated in early national period. And then even if we keep looking at that, if we go in a little bit closer for inspection, we see, for example, with George Washington, who is the father, he's called the father of our country. And he was a man of high moral character. And, we can say that even though he owned slaves, because their worldview is so much different than today. But all these myths cropped up around Washington. I remember doing a paper about him in grad school, and there were these 4 main myths that basically made him a monument. But these myths, for example, you've heard the story about he cut down the apple tree, and then his dad asked him, "Did you do this?" And he was like, "I cannot lie, I did this." That is a myth. That wasn't true. So these myths cropped up to help mold this model of nationalism. And then the fifth element was American symbols that started to become prominent. The eagle was a symbol of America. The stars and stripes, the flag, became this symbol that was an element that helped nationalism really start to gain ground. So you might want to be aware, might want to know those 5 elements that were a part of this model of American nationalism during this time. We could say that this was an error not only of good feelings, but also an error of a great increase in patriotism. Any questions on those things before we move on?
Okay, so the first element is like starting to have a common past, and like the second one is and the
Second one, yeah, common destiny.
Sorry, and then a common enemy.
Yeah.
And then the American symbols.
The 4th one was the myths.
Yeah.
And then the 5th one was the symbols.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to switch back to the slides. And as we talk about this new nationalism, we're going to see 4 areas that really contributed to it. The first area would be economic nationalism. Economic nationalism. So in 1811, the charter for the first Bank of the United States had expired. It was founded in 1791 under Washington's administration, and especially the influence of Alexander Hamilton. It was set up with a 20-year charter, and so that expired in 1811. And President Madison and Congress did not renew that charter at that time. Well, do you remember that the 7 Years' War left Britain with this massive debt, and so they started taxing the colonies? Well, the War of 1812 also was an expensive war, and since there was no national bank, you had a lot of these state banks loaning money and printing their own paper money. And, for example, the money that was printed in New York was not the same as the money printed in Virginia. And so a lot of times states would not recognize other states' money. So there was financial problems after the War of 1812. So Madison, who was more like Jefferson than Hamilton. Madison was opposed to the national bank, and he wanted a more agrarian society. He kind of had a change of light. He now saw the value of a national bank. And so during his last year in 1816, the Second National Bank was founded. And it also had a 20-year charter. It was founded in 1816 in the city of Philadelphia. Its primary purpose was to bolster and stabilize the American economy. Also, it was to create a very sound national currency. They needed to stop states from printing their own money and have one national currency. They also granted loans to farmers, small manufacturers, and entrepreneurs. And then the national bank would regulate the state banks, and especially their own issuance of paper money in the states. So you can see that by creating a national currency, offering loans to farmers and entrepreneurs and others, this was an effect to this had the effect of nationalizing the young republic. So the economic nationalism. Closely related to that was a tariff in 1816. And this happened during Muncie. This would have still been Madison, his last year of the presidency. But after the War of 1812, I think I mentioned this Tuesday, some of these things we are kind of a little bit of a rehash of Tuesday, but during the War of 1812, British British merchants were not able to sell their wares in America. So after the war, America was flooded with British goods, and they were underselling American companies. So the tariff of 1816 was implemented to basically end foreign imports, but especially the British flooding of their cheap goods. And it was to help American consumers by encouraging American citizens to buy American products. Also during this tariff, or also an aim of this tariff, was to protect two new industries that were emerging in America. One was the iron industry. I believe that was spearheaded by the Stark family of New England. Antonio Stark the first. Or Tony Stark. Y'all look like you're sleepy. Okay. Just seeing if you're with me still. I've got this great story for you. I had open heart surgery 1.5 years ago, and they found that I had a leaky aortic valve, and then I had a 5.2 millimeter aneurysm on the top of my aorta. I was pretty close to my heart exploding, and so they, of course, examined my heart before surgery, and so they were going to have to give me a new valve. So I have a mechanical valve now. But during the surgery, I had an extra vein called a superior canis vein that I guess I was born with, and it wrapped around my heart. So during surgery, they would not be able to do what they needed to do for about a 20-minute period. So they would have to completely take me off of the machine that would keep blood pumping through my body, because they have to stop your heart. So they would take me off that machine and lower my body temperature to about 75 degrees. So I had no blood going through my body for that long. And they had like a 20-minute window to get that done and then get the machine back on. So anyway, long story short, one of the ladies in my church got me a Captain America shirt because I was frozen for like 20 minutes. And I said, you also should have got me an Iron Man shirt because I have a mechanical valve right here. So anyway, there's nothing to that story. I just like to tell it. So the iron industry was protected by this tariff. And then the other industry was the textile industries, which we mentioned Tuesday. The textile mills and factories had started to crop up. Now, here's something you might want to take note of about this tariff. All three regions were on board with it, even the South. Remember, there are tensions during this period of nationalism between the three sections. And usually the South, they are by themselves against the West and the Northeast. But with this tariff, this was one of the few things that all three regions were on board with. The South was on board because they were anticipating that they too would start to see more industries in their region, and so they would benefit from this. So that's a significant point to know about the tariff of 1816. I feel like that is a great test question. What was significant about the tariff of 1816? All right, any questions before we move to the next influence on the new nationalism? So we had the economic nationalism, which included the tariff of 1816. But we're saying that the tariff is a little bit. The tariff is in itself a individual element because of its significance. The third thing is the War of 1812 benefited the colonies in that it revealed some weaknesses that the new republic needed to deal with. And so after break, we're going to come back and talk about internal improvements. So it's 10:13. Let's take a 6-minute break. Use the bathroom, get a drink, whatever you need to do. And at 10:19, we'll start back up. All right, we're back. And I am looking here. Our test will be Thursday, the 11th. So that is in 2 weeks. So yeah, that gives us 3 class periods to finish chapter. We'll finish chapter 9 on Tuesday, 10, and then 11. So yeah, we'll have plenty of time for that. Okay, internal improvements. The War of 1812 pointed out to many Americans the insufficiency of our roads at the time. And so there was a push to improve not just the roads, but also the other modes of transportation. I'm just going to add a few things that we did not cover on Tuesday to this. But in the improving of the existing roadways, the goal was to remove tree stumps that still would have been in those roadways. Also in rivers. Also rivers that had sandbars, to get rid of those sandbars. And along with improving the existing roads to build more roads. And in 1818, the first national road was opened, the Cumberland Road, and it went from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Virginia. And then by 1838, 20 years later, 600 more miles had been added further west. And so the Cumberland Road, being the first interstate road in our country, went to Vandalia, Illinois. So we've already talked about canals were constructed. Railroads at the time were mostly in the Northeast, but they expanded to have over 30,000 miles by 1850. So this was a weakness that was pointed out from the War of 1812, but also it was understood that it would help improve the economy as more and more goods and produce could be transferred from place to place. It would also accelerate the settlement of people to the west. It would also help farmers. So this was something that was interconnecting the colonies and creating more of a national mindset. It was still controversial, though, because federal funds were being used for these improvements, and many people thought those should be improvements and new innovations should be funded by the states or by private investors. All righty. Any questions before we move to the fourth influence on the new nationalism? So you have the economic influence with the new Second Bank of the United States. You have the Tariff of 1816. Now you have the internal improvements, and these things are helping to build a new nationalism, a stronger nationalism. The fourth thing is the influence of the judiciary, the Supreme Court specifically. During this time, the Chief Justice was a man by the name of John Marshall. And surprise question, see if you remember the U.S. immigration test from Module 1. Who is our current Chief Justice? No Googling. John Roberts. That's right. Good job. So John Marshall is the Chief Justice at this time, and he is the Chief Justice for 34 years. He had a great influence, especially since it was the infancy period of the Supreme Court, and his strong leadership really set some precedent for how the Supreme Court operates today. Specifically, under his leadership, the Supreme Court helped to strengthen and expand the federal government's power at the expense of state rights, state power. I want to mention quickly a significant Supreme Court case in 1803, Marbury versus Madison. And even though the Republicans, that would be Jefferson and Madison, even though they won that case against the Federalists, John Adams, the Supreme Court, after that case, the precedent had been developed and still is today that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. They have the power to review all laws and make sure that they're constitutional. So that was in 1803, very early in Chief Justice Marshall's leadership. But the cases that you want to be familiar with for our test, this first one here is Dartmouth College versus Woodward in 1819. And the issue was about contracts. Dartmouth College is one of the original Ivy League schools, and it was created basically by a royal charter or contract. So it was a school that was under New Hampshire control, or I'm sorry, New Hampshire wanted it to be under their control. The Supreme Court ruled on it and said that the college charter stands. That is, it's a university that is not controlled by the state. It's a private university. and the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot interfere with private contracts. Related to that principle of laissez-faire, that government should not interfere with private enterprise. So that was a strike against states. A second case in 1819 is McCulloch versus Maryland. The issue here is, does a state, such as Maryland, in this case, does it have the authority to tax the second bank of the United States? The branch in Baltimore, the branch of the second bank of the United States, the branch in Baltimore had been taxed by Maryland. So the Supreme Court took up this case. Can a state place a tax on a federal agency? The Supreme Court said no. A state cannot do that. Marshall, under his leadership, the Supreme Court exercised a principle called obiter dictum. And this allows the Supreme Court to see if Congress has the power to create banks. Supreme Court said that the Congress does have the power to create national banks under the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. They said that the power to tax is a power to destroy, and therefore Maryland cannot be given that power to tax the national government. So another court case by the Supreme Court that contributed to a growing nationalism and a diminishing of state authority. There's one more case that we want to look at. Any questions on those two cases from 1819? So 5 years later was another case that's very important. Gibbons versus Ogden. And this dealt with the issue of interstate commerce. Now, there's also intrastate commerce, INTRA, but this one deals mostly with interstate commerce. Interstate commerce would be how one state's decisions would affect other states. Intrastate commerce is just business that is within one state. So the issue here was a man by the name of Aaron Ogden from New York. He had been given exclusive rights by the New York government to ferry people and goods up and down the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. So just picture on your screen here, let's say you see where the arrow is that I'm using. Just picture a line down the middle here. That would be the Hudson River. And you have New York over here to the east, and then New Jersey over here to the west. And so Aaron Ogden can use his ferry to take people and goods back and forth across. And he has a monopoly in New York. However, there's another man by the name of Thomas Gibbons who has a federal license to operate his ships on the Hudson River. And so he competed with Ogden for business. And so it went to the Supreme Court. And the decision was only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce, not the states. And so they ruled that Ogden's state monopoly in New York conflicted with Gibbons' federal license. And so there again, another blow against state authority and a strengthening of federal power. And so these three cases specifically helped in the increasing new nationalism that was emerging during this first half of the 19th century. Any questions? All righty. So all of these things that we have discussed were basically a vision of Henry Clay, who was a senator from Kentucky who became the Speaker of the House. And he called it his American system, which included high tariffs on foreign imports, the public works, in other words, the improvements and public works of roads, bridges, railroads, canals, things like that, which would help all three regions. The wealth from the tariffs would allow Northerners to buy farm products from the West and the South. Revenue that the government would collect would be used to continue to build that infrastructure. But overall, you can see here at the bottom, the South was not convinced. A strong national bank was a part of Henry Clay's vision. And so all of these things basically were fulfillments of his vision. And really, Clay was the successor, we might say the unofficial successor, to Alexander Hamilton's vision of a strong federal government that would nurture a diversified economy, which would include agriculture, industry, and commerce. And here you can see kind of the interrelatedness. This protective tariff to get funding was related to some of Thomas Jefferson's legislation. These transportation improvements would be to help the sections, but this was opposed by sectional jealousy. Good transportation would lead to industrial growth. The South and West could cheaply transport raw materials. The North and the East were the big supporters of this. Remember, the only thing that all three were on board with was the tariff of 1816. And then with good transportation, manufactured goods could then be shipped back to the South and the West. So Clay's American system was really a vision for a strong federal union. Any questions on that before we jump into James Monroe? Now, this error of good feelings is the same error, but we're going to look at it basically from the executive viewpoint, starting with James Monroe. Really, we already said that it started with Madison, but for our sake, we're going to start with Monroe, who basically was don't want to say handpicked, but he was the one that Madison endorsed to follow him. He was Madison's Secretary of State and Secretary of War. So he was in the same, he was cut from the same cloth as Jefferson and Madison. He was from Virginia, like those men. And so being the fifth president, he is the fourth one of the first five to be from Virginia. So Virginia still has a stronghold on the executive branch. One of the great pluses, though, about James Monroe is he is probably one of the most qualified men to be president. I mean, he's up there with Washington, maybe even ahead of Washington. Not only was he endorsed by Madison, but Thomas Jefferson really regarded him highly. So that was one of the pluses of having Monroe as president. Following Madison and Jefferson, he was a Republican. You might write this down in your notes because we did not go over it, but I'm assuming you read it in the textbook. You had two parties at the beginning of our republic. You had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists had our first two presidents in George Washington and John Adams. And then when Jefferson became president in 1800, you had the Democratic Republican Party now in office. That is very significant because that was the first time you had in our country the changing of the executive when the parties were different. It was a peaceful change of leadership. When Monroe becomes president, he continues the leadership by Democratic Republicans, and by this time, it's just been basically switched to Republicans. Not to be confused with the Republicans of today. That doesn't happen until 1860. But, or 1856. But with Monroe becoming president, the Federalist Party starts to die out, and by 1820, it's gone. Pretty much. And this is a part of the era of good feelings, because it's just a one-party system, and so there's not that hostility in the federal government. And in 1817, you can see here that Monroe took a goodwill tour after he was elected. And even in New England, he received, New England, which would have been a strong Federalist area, he received a very heartwarming welcome from the New England citizens. And so a Boston newspaper was the place where this phrase, the era of good feelings, began. And it really just describes a peaceful and prosperous era that was characterized by for a lack of better description, political harmony. It didn't last long, but this was what came in with James Monroe. So we'll pick up there on Tuesday, and we will finish with Monroe's administration and move into Andrew Jackson's leadership as president in the Jacksonian democracy era. One thing that we'll also highlight, make sure you remind me so I don't forget, but in 1816, you had the beginning of what was called the Underground Railroad, which helped slaves to escape the South. So take note of that and help me to remember that when we come back on Tuesday. Any questions? All right, have a great weekend. Look forward to seeing you on Tuesday.
Bye.
See you later.